Okay, welcome to our Shabbat class, Parashat Toledot, the mystery and depth behind the Bechorah exchange. That's right. It's the famous interaction that we know about in the beginning of Parashat Toledot, in which Yaakov and Esav have an interaction between them, and eventually something called Bechorah, which we loosely translate into English, a birthright, is sold from Esav to Yaakov. What's behind that sale? What is the objective and the underlying goals of the Torah in presenting to us that, so to speak, a transaction of a Bechorah, whatever that means? What's its significance? So let's just start by talking about this concept, this word called Bechorah. What is it? What does a birthright mean? What we do know for certain, and our Mefarshim, our commentaries all echo this idea, and that is that it's not a halachic Bechorah. In other words, it's not a Torah-driven law that we know of. Of course, obviously, we're not talking about a Peter Rechem, a Bechor of the firstborn from the womb, who has certain rights in and of himself, because that you can't sell, obviously. And we're not even talking about the first paternal firstborn from the father. And the reason is because we don't really speak of laws pre-Matan Torah. And even though, according to many, our Avot, Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, through prophecy, observed Torah and Mizvot, although it was prior to Ma'amad Har Sinai, that's not something that's at all explicit in the Torah, at best hinted to. And so therefore, and furthermore, there is no reason to believe that that actual law called the Bechorah, or the Bechor, who gets Pishanayim, who gets a double inheritance, if he's the firstborn from the father, is sellable. That has to do with the actual birth and chronology of ages of the children. You can't change fact. How do you sell something like that? And apparently, whatever was exchanged in our parasha was something very exchangeable and sellable. And so what was this Bechorah? And our Mefarshim, by and large, stand in a very similar spirit with this. And that is that the Bechorah is some type of right. And that's why they call it in English, perhaps, a birthright. It's some type of automatic prestige that is given to a child, to a son who was born first. It has to do with honor. It has to do with a certain passage of rights from his father, and that is to receive certain form of dignity, of honor, of prestige. That can come off in a financial consequence. Perhaps as they move on with generations, something that has to do with a governmental military right in terms of the lineage and descendants. And that, apparently, let's not call it sellable, but it's forgivable by the side that is the fortunate recipient of that birthright, by this Bechor. If you want to forgive, as is the case in regular monetary law, a right, one is and marriage as well, one is welcome to do so. And so it seems that this certain prestige, this certain birthright earned, not really earned, but automatically gifted by society to someone, a paternal firstborn, can be foregoed, overlooked, passed on, perhaps for some compensation to another one of the siblings. Now, that's what it was. Why in the world is Yaakov Avinu interested in something like this? Now, to be sure, we know that he did not see any necessary financial benefit from this in his lifetime. We don't know of any type of positive ramifications that this sale had for Yaakov Avinu in a material way. In fact, quite the contrary. We see him suffering in terms of his physical existence and material wealth for years, as he's thrust out of his land and he has to work for decades for his father-in-law, and he's cheated, and he goes through family difficulties, and until he comes back eventually as a wealthier man, that wasn't his fate, and certainly was not more powerful and wealthy by the presentation of the Torah than his brother Isaac. So why did Yaakov then make sure and sort of, you don't want to say manipulate the circumstances, but find a way to procure and buy this right of Bechorah? And what we have explained in the past is that this material status, this prestige, is something that Yaakov Avinu, like his mother Rivka, had incredible insight in terms of the future of his descendants in Am Yisrael, and that this nation was destined, if they were going to be the light to the nations and the representation of God on earth, not just to be a nation of spiritual fortitude, but one of material fortitude. In other words, not just to demonstrate a relationship to God and be a model for the world in terms of ritual observance and in terms of moral behavior, yes, but also in terms of the proper way to run a society, to run a military, to run an economy, and to therefore merit this status of prestige that the Bechorah would lend hand to and show the world the way it's done. As I've said in the past, as opposed to Yitzhak Avinu, who was such a great lover of people, and especially his children, and a believer in the potential of all, that he was, so to speak, innocent to the extent that he believed in a two-state solution, as I like to call it, in the future. A Yaakov and Esav, double-headed state. Let Esav remain there. Let him be the material recipient. Let him be the one to run the physical dimension of this future nation, be it governmentally, militarily, economically, and Yaakov will be the rabbi, so to speak. And to that, Rivka's original dream and her great insight passed on to her son Yaakov, and his incredible foresight understood that it's one package deal. You live a godly Torah life that is complete, well-rounded, and runs the full scope of all aspects of life. Yaakov understood this. And therefore, it was this Bechorah, this birthright, that he had to be able to procure and earn, or let's say, hook on to the rights of, in order to be able to put himself and his descendants in the proper position as we move on. He understood this was a pivotal moment in Jewish history after the first two forefathers, Abraham and Yitzhak, and a possible split of the nation. And he took every precaution, therefore, based on his young but brilliant prophetic mind and insight, how to set him and his future nation up for success. And he made his move. So we're going to dive into this little episode. Before we do, it's fair to mention that even though from this episode, the Torah gives a very clear depiction of a negative side of Esav and contrasts this to Yaakov, and therefore makes clear the distinction that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to make and his choice between these two children of Yitzhak in this pivotal moment of history. There was some insight prior to this exchange between Yaakov and Esav that the Torah gave us in a very objective way. The Torah explained to us a few Pesukim earlier, the young men grew older, and Vahi Esav ish yodei asayib ish sadeh. Without going too deeply or negatively, he was simply a man of the field, a man of survival, a person who earned his living as a hunter, and a person who was the master of his padnasah in a very crude life way. You know, he was a blue-collar worker, so to speak, was Esav. That's the most positive light we could shed on that description. While, on the other hand, Yaakov and Ishtam, Yoshev Ohalim. Time has a number of implications. Simple is not so accurate. Whole and complete, perfect, is really a more popular usage throughout Tanakh of that word tam. Yoshev Ohalim. Some say Yoshev Ohalim, which means he was a shepherd, which we see later on that he was definitely experienced in that. Like as some say, he was Yoshev Ohali. He stuck to one tent, to one woman. He wasn't promiscuous. He was very loyal. He was very disciplined in his moral behavior. And of course, Hakamim's famous sentiment that they glean from this term, and that he was Yoshev Ohali. He sat. He was a genius. He was an academic. He was an intellect. He was spiritual. He was connected to God, and he studied. All of those can be found to be true as we go across the course of the storyline of Yaakov Avinu's life. So there was the early depiction of the contrast between these two young men, Yaakov and Esav. Certainly one you can call material, and the other one you can call disciplined and moral within a material life, to say the least. So with that backdrop, this episode begins. So once upon a time, following the Parashat, we're in Perek Kaf, chapter 25, Pasuk Kaf Tet, verse 29. And we know the story, but let's go through it very briefly. Vayazed Yaakov Nazid, Vayabu Esav ben Hasadev Ayef. Mefarshim tell us that both the verb noun Vayazed Nazid has to do with cooking. He cooked some cooked item that it'll turn out to be lentils later in the story, some lentil dish. And Esav is coming from the field and he's tired. That's the picture that's being painted over here. It's a setup for what is to come. We're not really given any context over here, although Midrash tells us that Avraham Avinu, we can't figure out in terms of chronology that the boys were 15 when Avraham Avinu passed away. And perhaps this was the actual date of his death. We're told of this food, the choice food of mourners, as we know until today, with the ades, right? The lentils. And that's why Yaakov was cooking it. But be that as may, we know he's cooking. We know Esav is tired. That's the setup. V'yomer Esav Yaakov, har'iteni na min ha'adom hazeh, ki ayef anochi, aken kara shemo Edom. This pasuk is so familiar to us that we are, as often happens, guilty of overlooking the obvious and the blatant questions. Yaakov exclaims to Yaakov, pour me, please, from this Adom. And he repeats it twice, this very red dish. Why does that matter? Because he's explaining, I'm ayef, I'm tired. So pretty please, can I have it? He explained it as red, and in a bizarre manner, the Pasuk tells us, therefore, he called, in singular, he called his name Edom. Well, first of all, who called who or what? Does this mean that Yaakov called Esav Edom? Or that Esav called himself Edom? Or that Esav called the food Edom? Any of the three are possible grammatically. And why in the world is this significant right now, in the middle of this episode, to tell us this? Now, of course, we know, but later on, the descendants and nation of Esav would be called Edom. Fine. But right now, really? And what exactly is happening? Who's the who and the what? And the truth is, all three possibilities are offered to us by our commentaries. Could very well be that Esav himself called this dish Edom, red. He felt like it gave him a breath of life. He was fainting, it was collapsing, satisfied him so much. And therefore, it was him that said, the redness, I love it, right? Is that significant? I don't know, but he started to call it that. We have all nicknames for foods, right? This was his mahshi, called it Edom, red. I love the red. On the other hand, could very well be that he felt that was something fitting for him, Edom. And the redness, some of the Mefarshim point out, has to do with blood. Very much is something that he reflected upon in his vocation, in his talent and skill and profession and way of living. He killed. He was a hunter. He saw blood all the time. Blood. I love that red. And here, perhaps in a very blatant way, Esav, excuse the pun, was showing his true colors, right? The color red. That's who I am, he said. I love things to be called red because I relate to something murderous, albeit maybe with animals at least, but in my regular material consumption. And of course, you can say that Yaakov, and then by extension, others also called him Edom, based on the possibilities we just mentioned. And the Torah here finds reason in this very passage before we move on to depict and describe and characterize Isa. And all three, and it doesn't really matter so much as to who's calling what Edom, but all three are based on the same spirit of things. And here you can say that the Torah is not being so objective, but somewhat subjective. And this is very much a scorn and a ridicule to Esav at this point in time. He was stooped in the material. He was consumed by food, by his material livelihood, the redness of blood, of the attractiveness of it, of the indulgement in the physical and the material. The Torah is being very honest and candid with us at this point to tell us that this is who he was, and therefore the name was called Edom. As at this point in time, we see a person that maybe not with an evil character, but certainly with somewhat of a shallow character. This is the pshat. It's an interesting response. Yaakov says, of course, we understood already that he was waiting for the opportunity to purchase this bechorah, as we have explained. But he says, Mechra chayom, sell like the day, your bechorah to me. And in fact, 2 Pesukim later, he says again, Hishab ali kayom, swear to me like the day. What is this about? We know that later on, some parashiyot later, we'll see a significance to the bechor, when Yaakov in his old age gets to bless his two grandchildren, children of Yosef, of Menashe and Ephraim. And every step of the way of that ritual was critical, putting the left and the right hand on which child and saying what and what type of beracha. Yaakov was setting this up for himself. And he says, I want this sale to be kayom. Does it mean clear as day, as some say? Does it mean the actual time of today? In other words, as we live today, what exactly is kayom referring to? But the main spirit of the word is that what Yaakov was asking for was transparency, and that's incredibly ironic because there are some that point out, perhaps over the coming episodes, maybe Has v'Shalom, we can say this, but somewhat of a weakness, or at least not one of the strengths of Yaakov, with his mannerisms, with eventually with his episode coming up with Esav and his father, and disguising himself, and later with Laban, until he reformed and perfected himself to an amazing way in terms of honesty and integrity. But here, he is Hayom, calling for transparency. I want this to be recorded. I want everyone to know this. And I'm not trying to hide anything. I want this Mechrat to be Hayom. And here is the contrast. Here, we're being presented the stark difference between them, where he was talking about Yom. And Yaakov Abinu was looking at a day, a picture, and wanted non-material possession, although that might be the material, what the Bechorah stood for. But he was looking at a future. He was looking at an eventuality, ramifications, long-term implication. While Esav, in his response, his retort to Yaakov was, I'm dying today. I'm talking about what happens to me today. It means I'm always at risk. So why should I buy life insurance? It doesn't pay. It'll be too expensive. Why do I care about a bechorah? Who knows how long my life will be? And he thought about today. He thought about the material. He was stooped in the present. While Yaakov Avinu was very much open to what we call foresight. Ezu hacham haroet hanolad. And the larger picture of the history that was before him. And so Yaakov Avinu was intent right now on doing this the right way, in the open, transparent, official way, right here, right now. And the Torah is so, in its brevity, ridicules Esav for his lack of concern and lack of sensitivity to what's really going on over here. And he told him, Shabali, I want to swear. I want this on record. There should be no question. And the Torah goes on to describe in 5 verbs rather. After Yaakov, Matalon, Esav, Lechem, Uzid, Adashim, some bread, lentils. And it says, Vayocha, Vayesh, Vayakum, Vayela, Vayelach, Vayibez Esav. Esav belittled the Bechorah. He ate, he went, he drank. This is what he cared about, physical lifestyle. Now, the truth is that we're physical beings. And the Goyim, nations of the world around us, live physically. And as long as they follow the 7 mitzvot, we're happy with that. And so it's not the lowliness of the non-Jacob tribe. It's the exalted nature. It's the eye-opening perspective, godliness of the Jacob tribe, of Yaakov Avinu. And it's here, this pivotal moment, in this small episode that seems to be a little enigmatic and confusing, but really is very direct and simple, where the Torah demonstrates to us why Kadosh Baruch Hu made this choice in terms of the 3rd generation of Abraham, Yitzhak, and not a shared 2-state solution, Esav, Yaakov, but Yaakov himself, because of the nature of the distinct, stark contrasts of nature between these 2 young men, and the wonderful traits of Yaakov Abinu that earned him the right to eventually be called Abinu and be the 3rd leg of Jewish history. Amen.